Erev Tov, good evening, and thank you for joining us for our second speaker on the film Upheaval. Very, very interesting. I hope that a lot of you have seen it already. Documentary on the career and life of Menachem Begin. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, a little bit of marketing for what's coming up. This program is sponsored by the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival in partnership with the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation B'nai Tikva, and Diablo Valley Hadassah, and underwritten by several generous donors. Their names are on our website. So thank you, all of you, for everyone who's an underwriter, for making our year-round programs possible. For those who don't already know, we are going back to the movie theater on February 25th for our 28th year of bringing films to the community. We will have a 6-day run, then a week of siesta, and then 2 weeks of online films. All the films except one will be repeated online with the extra addition of some wonderful short features and 2 full-length films as well. More about that to come at a future time, and or on Real Talk, our weekly e-communication. And now, Avi Shilon. He is a historian, a journalist, a political scientist, and was a visiting scholar and Israel Institute Fellow at New York University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Ben Gurion University and also at a university in China. We can ask him in questions what he was, to whom he was lecturing. Was it a Judaic Studies program or Middle East Studies? He has published several books, including Ben Gurion, His Later Years in the Political Wilderness, which was later made into a film, a documentary, Ben Gurion Epilogue, which we actually showed several years ago, and Menachem Begin, A Life, as well as articles in Middle Eastern Studies, the Jewish Quarterly Review, Middle East Journal, and is also written for Haaretz newspaper. And now it is our pleasure and privilege to introduce Avi Shilon.
Thank you very much, Riva. I'm very happy to be here, and it is an important subject, and he is an important leader, whether if you like him or not. And in the next half an hour or so, I will talk about 6 major issues with respect to Menachem Begin after he rose to power, which means after the 77 upheaval. And then we will dedicate 15 minutes or so for your Q&A. You can ask me about Begin, but you can ask me about other stuff which relates to Israel and to Israel studies. So it's early in the morning in Israel, but I'm feeling good. So let's get started. So I think the 6 major issues with respect to Begin that we need to talk about are like that. The first is his attitude towards the Jewish religion. The second is decision to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor. The third issue, which is important to discuss about Begin, is his attitude towards the issue of Mizrahim. Yeah. Obviously, we should talk a bit about the peace agreement with Egypt, the failure in the First Lebanon War, and the fact that this great orator ended his life in a seclusion for 9 years in his home. So let me please get straight into business. I think that when David Ben Gurion, the founding father of Israel, when he envisioned the Israeli society, he thought about the new Jew. What does it mean, the new Jew? He wanted to create a Jew which would be detached from the Judaism in the diaspora or in the exile. David Ben-Gurion's Jew should be secular, serving in the army. He should be knowledgeable about the Bible, and he should speak Hebrew. But with respect to the Jewish religion, he should, in a way, abandon the belief in God, abandon his attachment to the rabbinical establishment, and actually create a Jew which should be much more national than religious. When Begin rose to power, he took a totally different direction. For Begin, Zionism, in contrast to the way Ben-Gurion saw Zionism, was not a revolution in the Jewish history, but a continuation. This is why, if Ben-Gurion wanted us to rebel against the rabbinical establishment, wanted us to create a new Judaism which should be based about the attachment to the land, attachment to the state, for Begin, Judaism should remain the most instrumental part of Jewish identity. And by that, Begin changed the path of the Israeli society. And I think that if you look about the Israeli society of today, in which most of the Israelis are much more traditional than Ben-Gurion expected them to be, we can say that Begin, as an historical figure, is the most influential in order to understand the current Israeli society. And how did he make this change in the Israeli society to be much more, let's say, Jewish than Israel? Well, Begin took several important decisions immediately after he rose to power. The first one, and this is a bit folkloristic, but still important, he is the first prime minister of Israel who went to the Kotel after winning the election and before the day of the election. Nowadays, no Israeli leader would dare not to go to the Kotel and to take a photo there before the election and after being elected. But in fact, Begin was the first one to take this act, and Ben-Gurion would never dreamed about it. Yeah, actually, Yair Lapid, the current prime minister, is the first one after Begin, the first one in 50 years that preferred to go to Yad Vashem after he was elected or actually nominated, than to go to the Kotel. The second issue was to give the portfolio of the Minister of Education to a minister from a religious party. Up until 1977, when Mapai and later on the Labour Party was the ruling party in Israel, it was very custom that the portfolio of the education will be the minister who is going to serve as the Minister of Education will come from the ruling party, i.e. from Mapai. Begin decided that this position should belong to a religious person, because for Begin, in order to strengthen the Israeli society, in order to build it, you need to base it on religious values. Now, if you're taking into account that since 1977 up until today, most of the ministers of education in Israel came from a religious party, religious national party, you can understand why the outcome is that the current generation of the Israeli society have a tendency to be much more traditionalist than in the previous generation of 1977. Another important act that Begin took after he became the prime minister was to give to Agudat Israel, the ultra-religious party, the position of the head of the finance committee of the Knesset. By that, they had a lot of they could arrange the Israeli budget in a way that would allocate much more funds to the yeshivas, yeah, and to ultra-religious activities. Moreover, if Ben-Gurion decided, when he established the state, to exempt 400 yeshivas people from serving in the army, he did it out of political consideration, and because he was sure, he was convinced that as time will go on, most of the people, not only in Israel, all around the world, will become more and more secular because of science and education. Ben-Gurion was actually wrong. We see today, with the internet, with science, with a lot of technological progress, that people don't stop being religious, don't stop being believers. But this is what Ben-Gurion thought. So for him to give 400 exemption for yeshiva students from the army was like, okay, I'm keeping them in the museum. It wouldn't grow into a bigger phenomenon. Begin, expanded the exemption for yeshiva students, the exemption from the army into the thousands. And for Begin, he took this decision out of a different outlook. For Begin, it wasn't out of political consideration or because he thought that these guys are the last one to serve in the yeshiva. For Begin, it was really, like the religious people saying, really an act of defending Israel. He believed that in the Jewish state, you should, as a Jewish state, let yeshiva students pray instead of fight, because this is another way to defend Israel. Another issue, we are all familiar with the fact that El Al, the main Israeli company, is not flying on Shabbat and holidays. For us, it's natural. But actually, it was Begin that decided that the national career of Israel should not fly on Shabbat and not on holidays, because in a Jewish state, we should emphasize the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, even if El Al lost billions of dollars or shekels by that. Begin said the Shabbat, this is the thing that kept the Jews together, so each and every price to keep it is worth it. Another thing that Begin did with respect to the Jewish religion was the fact that he preferred the Orthodox way of Jewish religion. For example, when the issue of who is a Jew came to the Knesset, and the discussion was like today, whether we should accept the Reform way of conversion, whether we, the Israeli, should accept the conservative way of conversion to Judaism. For Begin, it was very clear. No, we should base our Judaism on the Orthodox way of life. By that, as we know, they harm the Reform section of Judaism. And up until today in Israel, even though in reality, if you think about it, most of the Israelis are much more closer to the Reform way of life or to the conservative way of life, there is a common understanding that the only way to serve the Jewish religion is by the Orthodox way. All of these things were made by Begin, and moreover, even when he was the commander of the Irgun in the pre-state era, he ordered his guy not to act during the Shabbat unless there is a specific circumstances that you need to have your operation in Shabbat. But for Begin, from the beginning, he understood the Jewish religion as the pillar, yeah, of the Jewish modern nationalism. And this is a huge difference between him and the leaders of the Labour Party. They understood Zionism as a revolution in the Jewish history, while Begin understood Zionism as a chain, in a new chain in the Jewish history. So far for Begin and the Jewish religion. Now I would like to talk about his decision to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor. As we all know, Israel, especially under Netanyahu, but also under the current government, did and actually doing everything in its capacity to stop the Iranian nuclear reactor. It sounds very natural. We don't want to have an enemy state with a nuclear capacity. But actually, it's not so natural. Israel could have thought about a different path, maybe to try to have a deal with the Iranians, maybe to establish a political alliance with the Iranians. I'm not saying that this could be. I'm not saying that this is easy. I just want to say that the fact that the Israeli government in the last maybe more than 10 years decided that it is its top priority to stop the Iranian from having a nuclear weapon is actually an idea which Begin decided about it. And Begin thought during the late 70s, that Israel as a state which was emerged out of the Holocaust should not let any Arab enemy state to possess a nuclear weapon. By that, he took a very, let's say, brave decision to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor, even though the Americans did not give him a green light, and even though many in the security establishment warned Begin that if he's going to do it, he can put the new peace agreement with Egypt at risk. And obviously, there was also a lot of risk with respect to the pilot themselves. But for Begin, it was loud and clear. Israel should never let any enemy state to possess a nuclear weapon as a result, or maybe more accurately, as a lesson from the Holocaust. By that, this idea became the Begin doctrine. When Ehud Olmert was the Prime Minister of Israel between 2006 and 2009, he decided to bomb the Syrian nuclear reactor, again based on Begin formula that Israel should never let any enemy state possess a nuclear weapon. So Olmert followed him, Netanyahu is trying to follow him, the current Prime Minister Lapid and the former Prime Minister Bennett accepted this formula. And again, what is important for me to tell you with respect to it, that even though it sounds natural because we got used to the fact that Israel is trying to do anything to stop the Iranians from having a nuclear weapon, it could be not so natural without Begin. We could think about other paths to contain Iran than to stop them even militarily. So this is the second issue. The third issue, which is very important, is with respect to the Mizrahim. I think that when Israel was established, it's not that I think, it's a fact, that when Israel was established, 80% of the Israelis were Ashkenazim. Even today, in most of the places of the elite in Israel, there are still more Ashkenazim than Mizrahim. And the issue of Mizrahim and Ashkenazim became a major issue during the 70s, when the second generation of the Mizrahim found themselves in a position of complaint about the attitude that the state inflicted on their parents. And the idea of the Labour Party was that the Mizrahim, since they came from Arab countries, yeah, they should change or even erase their own culture. Because if your culture is based on Arab culture, you need to change it in order to be, in order not to be backward. So in many cases, Mizrahim, especially in the first generation, they were shy to project their knowledge in Arabic. They were shy to listen to Arab music. They felt that they need to be fixed and to be much more modern and Western. Yeah. And only when Begin rose to power, Begin looked at the Mizrahim totally differently. Because for Begin, the most important or the most, the most important identity is your Jewish identity. He didn't care if your Judaism stemmed from an Arab culture or from a Polish culture or from a European culture. The fact that you are a Jew, this is the most important. He didn't want to convert, he didn't want to change the Mizrahim into something that they didn't wear. So Begin actually was the first one to accept the Mizrahi heritage, the Mizrahi culture, as equal to each and any other Jewish culture from around the world. Moreover, Begin was the first one to open the ranks of the Likud to new Mizrahi leaders. Many of them, David Levy, Moshe Katsav, who became the president of Israel and ended his career in a very bad fashion, to put it mildly, Meir Shitri, Tzachi Hanegbi, many of those people could not find a place in the Israeli politics until Begin's era. Today, and I think especially in the last 2 decades, Israel is undergoing a Easternization process. If you look about Israeli music, it's a very Oriental music. If you look about Israeli food, everything in pita, it's very Mizrahi cuisine. Yeah. If you look even about the place of religion in the Israeli society, most of the Israelis today are traditionalists. Traditionalism was a Mizrahi form of Judaism because in Europe there was a binary, a dichotomy between the ultra-religious and the secular who wanted to rebel against the ultra-religious. In the Mizrahi state, which means the Arab states, the Jews of the Arab state, they didn't have this tension between secularism to religion. So they developed a much more moderate attitude, which can be termed as a traditionalist attitude. And during Ben Gurion's era, this traditionalist attitude was perceived as backward. Why? You are not secular enough. And on the other hand, you are not religious enough. Nowadays, in the academic circles, we tend to understand the traditionalism totally different. By being traditionalist, you can maintain your connection to the past and be also open to modernity. But during Ben Gurion's era, to be traditionalist was like, you are not this and not that, yeah? Begin changed it, and as I said, today most of the Israelis can be termed traditionalists, and this is another issue which affected the status of the Mizrahim, because once you can project your way of let's say religiosity without the need to be shy or to be to apologize about it, you can have much more you can feel much more at ease with your own identity. And obviously, the fact that most of the Israelis today are Mizrahim also strengthened the traditionalist phenomena. I want to talk now also about the issue of the first peace agreement with an Arab country. Obviously, it was Egypt that Begin signed with Sadat. We know the details of this agreement. Israel decided to pull out of the Sinai Peninsula, to evacuate the settlements there, and in return, Israel got the first peace agreement with Egypt, which was a strategic asset to the IDF, especially after the Yom Kippur War. Because of the peace treaty with Egypt, the army could rearrange itself. Israel saved a lot of money that was dedicated to defense the Sinai Peninsula, not to mention the fact that to have peace is always the most benevolent thing. But what I want to say is that when Begin signed this peace agreement with the Egyptians, many in the media, in the academic sphere, in the Israeli public were shocked because Begin had the image of the defender of the greater of Israel. Begin was known as someone who will never be ready to give up on any inch of Israeli territory. But this perception was based on misunderstanding of Begin. Because for Begin, the land of Israel, and again, it goes back to the fact that Begin had a very traditionalist perception. For Begin, the land of Israel was sacred not because of security needs, but because it's the biblical land of Israel. The land of Israel was sacred not because we need it, but because God promised it to us. So for Begin, there was a clear distinction between the biblical land of Israel, which means the West Bank and Gaza, Judea and Samaria, if to use Begin's terms, and the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was important, but only as a strategic asset. It wasn't important as a sacred land because it was never part of the biblical land of Israel. By that, Begin could utilize his attachment to the Jewish religion to convince right-wing religious person to agree to the withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. I mean, when he said to the right wing who were a opponent of the agreement, listen, I'm doing it, I'm giving them back the land because I'm taking a Jewish act because this land should not be sacred. It's a strategic asset and we can change it in exchange for another strategic asset like peace. He had much more leverage to convince his people, to accept the withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. And because most of his life, Begin was perceived as very radical, as someone who is will never be ready to give up on any inch, people did not understood the distinction which he made between the biblical land of Israel and other territories. This is why, by the way, Begin was ready not only to give up on the Sinai Peninsula, but also on the Golan Heights. He said that if the Syrian leader is ready in his wish for peace, we can go into negotiation. But again, the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula was not the same as he saw, was totally different in his perception than the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Moreover, Misha Arens, who later became the defense minister of Israel, he was against the agreement with Egypt. He told Begin, you are making a mistake. We shouldn't evacuate all of the settlements. We shouldn't give them all of the Sinai Peninsula. One reason for that is because he thought that if we are going to give them the Sinai Peninsula, eventually we're gonna lose the interest of the US to have an alliance with us, because we will not be so powerful as we were. But Aaron said to Begin, if you insist to do this peace agreement and to give them back the entire Sinai Peninsula, at least give them also Gaza. Why do we need to have control on so many Palestinians whom are in any way will not be ready to live under Israeli control? So Begin, and this is in accordance to Aaron's testimony, surprised Aaron with a very simple answer. How can you say that we should give Gaza back? Gaza is part of the biblical land of Israel. Then Aaron said, I realized that Begin is serious, that his outlook on the Israeli political affair stemmed from his deep conviction in the Jewish religion and not only stemmed out of realpolitik. Another issue which I want to talk about is actually the failure of the First Lebanon War. In this case, Begin, we need to understand Begin as a transformative leader. What does it mean, transformative leader? We have if to use a political science terms, an executive leader. Executive leader is someone who is trying to handle the day affair. He's like a CEO. And there are transformative leaders like Ben-Gurion and Begin. They really want to change the path of history. They really want to have an influence on the character of the Israeli society. And Begin, one of the lessons that he drew from the Holocaust is that not only that we survived, we should never forget that most of the world was not ready to do, if to put it mildly, the necessary effort to save the Jews. But by that, Begin didn't want to take revenge. Begin wanted to show that we are better. So one reason for the First Lebanon War in the eyes of Begin was to save the Christian minority from the Muslim, not only out of benevolence, also because he wanted to show the world, look, when we were the minority, nobody saved us. But now when we have the power, we are going to save the Christian as a lesson to the world that you should protect minorities. Now, this is classical Begin, because on the one hand, it's a very benevolent idea. On the other hand, in a way, it's too fantastic. He saw Israel as a state that could rearrange the Middle East and not only as a state that should maintain its own businesses. This was one reason for the First Lebanon War. Another reason, which was more important, was that Begin wanted to expel the PLO from Lebanon in order to weaken, not only to stop them from launching Katyushas into the northern part of Israel. His big aim was to expel the PLO from Lebanon in order to weaken the Palestinian national movement, and by that, again, to save the West Bank from the option of creating a Palestinian state. The third goal of Begin with respect to the First Lebanon War was to help the Christian not only to be saved by the Muslim, but also to help them to rule Lebanon. And by that, he wanted to create the second peace treaty with an Arab state, this time with Lebanon. When you think about this plan, it's a grandiose plan. It's a fantastic plan. You can even appreciate Begin's vision, but in reality, things became much more complicated. And Israel found itself, even though Israel entered Lebanon as the savior of the Christians, eventually the Christians and the Muslims and the Syrians and the PLO, all of them blamed Israel for invading Lebanon, and the war, and I would not delve into the details of it, the world became, this war became a mess, and Begin was always very, very sensitive to life was sacred to him. It was very hard for him to see each and every day how much Israeli young soldiers are being died for this war. Now, historians up until today debating the issue whether Ariel Sharon was back then the defense minister, misled Begin into this bigger vision of the war, and he should be responsible for this war, or Sharon was actually just obeying Begin's order. Now, I think that it's true that Begin didn't know anything or everything, about the development of the war. It's true that some of the things that Sharon did during this war were done without notifying Begin in advance. But it's not because Sharon misled Begin. Begin had a very interesting formula as a pattern of leadership. He always took responsibility for the action or the deeds of his people, yes? But he also always let the expert decide on the ground what would be the way to implement the Begin's vision. I mean, Begin used to draw the big ideology, the big aim, and to let the expert, in this case, the defense minister, to decide on the tactics. This was Begin's pattern of leadership also during the day of the Irgun. For example, he was not aware about the plan to take the Dir Yassin village. He was fully not aware to the details of the plan. But once it was done by his people, he took responsibility. In exchange, he was asking for loyalty. So throughout his career, he received a deep and profound loyalty from his people in exchange for taking responsibility on each and every failure of his people. This was his pattern of leadership during the Irgun era. This was his pattern of leadership in Lebanon. And this is why I don't think that we should believe that Sharon misled Begin. It's true that Sharon didn't share everything with Begin during this war. But it was done by Sharon because he understood his role as the one who should fulfill the bigger vision of Begin by his own tactics. Now, I said that Begin was always taking responsibility. And this is what actually he did with respect to the failure of this Lebanon. He didn't blame Sharon. He didn't try to explain why things went this way and not that way. He just, and I think this is amazingly, especially when you think about the current leaders of Israel, yeah, he just took responsibility in the most severe way. He actually punished himself. He went to his home and he said, if I cannot deliver, I even not going to explain. If I cannot deliver, so someone else should replace me. Adding to that, his misery after the death of his wife, Aliza. Adding to that Begin suffered before the war, not only from heart attack, but also from a stroke. Back then, it was not reported in the press. Yeah. So he became weak with respect to his health. And adding to that, the fact that Begin, like the biggest Hasidic leader, whom tend in many cases to ended their life in seclusion, I think that Begin, like the biggest Hasidic leader, was not only a prime minister, he was like a kind of a rabbi of Israel. And the fact that he ended his life in seclusion can be understood also in this light. Now, in order to conclude, if we want to understand the importance of Begin with respect to the current Israeli society, we can see it in several aspects. The first, as I said at the beginning, the fact that today, most of the Israelis, according to all of the surveys, will tell you that they are much more Jewish than Israelis. I mean, if you put a gun to their heads and ask, what is your deepest identity? And this is Begin. Begin always approached the listeners to his speeches with Jews. He never said Israelis. Yeah, this is again in contrast to what Ben Gurion wanted to create in Israel. Ben Gurion wanted to create the Hebrews, not the Jews. Yeah. Secondly, Begin opened the ranks of the Likud to the Mizrahim, and Israel as a society today is much more of an equal society, even though there are still differences between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Israel is much more an equal society, much more of as we put it, multicultural society. Yeah, Ben Gurion wanted to us to be with one uniform way of identity. Thirdly, we talk about the Begin doctrine, not to letting any enemy state to possess a nuclear weapon. Again, it sounds very natural, very simple, but Israel could adopt another strategy, but not Israel still adopting the Begin formula. Thirdly, I think the fact that he gave the position of the Minister of Education to a minister from the National Religious Party, yeah, and it became a costume in the Israeli politics, influenced the generation of the last 50 years since the upheaval. And obviously, if your curriculum as a student is based on national religious perception, it will affect you. And I want to conclude with a personal note. I think on Tuesday, it's a well-known fact that on Tuesday, we in Israel are going to go to the polls in the 5th time in 3 years. And a major issue, whether you like him or not, is Bibi Netanyahu. And a major issue is corruption, is champagne, cigars. If you look at Begin, the one who established the Likud, and you put him in juxtaposition to the current Israeli leadership, in terms of his modesty, dedication, he is like looking at someone from the Bible and someone from our era. And I think that the fact that when Begin ended his political career and just then realized that he even don't have an apartment of its own is very telling. And this is why, even though most of his life he was in the opposition, marked by Ben Gurion, marked by the Labour Party, in all of the polls in the last 5 years, when Israelis are being asked who is the most historical, who is the most important historical figure that you are missed the most, is Begin. And I don't think that Begin could believe that he eventually would be the most popular among Israeli prime ministers. So thank you very much. And I am ready to take your questions if you have.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Before I get to one of the questions from our attendees, what do you think Begin would say about the current coalition that Bibi may put forward with Ben Gvir and the more radical of the right?
This is a great question, because you know, when Kahana, yeah, it's like the let's call it the founding father of racism in Israel. Yeah, Ben Gvir is the followers of Kahana. When Kahana was elected to the Israeli Knesset for the first time during the 80s, Begin, like most of the Likud people, used to get out of the Knesset when Kahana is talking. Because for Begin, even though he was very much of a nationalist, he was totally against racism. Moreover, you know that when Israel established, Ben-Gurion decided to put the Arab citizens of Israel on the one hand, he decided to give them citizenship and to make them equal citizens in accordance to the law. But in reality, he put them under military law until 1964. And the party and the leader who was the most objected to put citizens under military law was Begin. Because for Begin, liberalism and nationalism, just like for Jabotinsky, went hand in hand. Today, unfortunately, in Israel, it's like if you are nationalist, if you are proud of the Israeli nation or the Jewish nation, it can go like Ben Gvir into racism. And if you are liberal, you can be anti-Zionist. Begin wanted to merge and succeeded in merging between liberalism and nationalism. So to your question, if to be more precise and simple, he would be very upset to see the head of the Likud going with Ben Gvir.
Question from our audience. Even though Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries, were raised politically by Begin, still there's a disparity in positions in academia, in finance, etc. Is it improved? Obviously it is improved, but is it greatly improved, or what is holding back certain segments of the population?
Yes, so for example, first of all, my parents are from Baghdad, from Iraq, yeah? And obviously in my generation and in the younger generation, it's totally improved, yeah? You cannot see differences in the middle, you cannot see differences in the street between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. But if we are going to the statistics, for example, if you're going to academic sphere, there are still something like, and this is an amazing fact, 10% of the Israeli professors are Mizrahim and the rest are Ashkenazim. And this is due to a lot of issues. For example, when they decided during the 50s to send the Mizrahim to the development towns, very far from Tel Aviv. When they decided to send the Mizrahim not to humanities schools, yeah? There are a lot of issues from the past that still holding the Mizrahim to be really equal, yeah? But we are in a process of achieving it. And this issue is being discussed very much in Israel right now in the late years, precisely because the situation of the Mizrahim has been improved. They are being able to talk more about the past. It's in a way, it resembles the issue of black and whites in America, that you can talk now much more about the suffering of the black not only because they are still in the same position, but also because their situation is being improved, so it's enabled them to talk about the past. So this is, in a way, it's the same in Israel. We are talking much more about this issue of Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, but we are talking about it also because the situation is getting better and better.
Another question, someone asked about the left-wing coalition, which we recently had with Arab parties. Do you think that, well, they didn't actually ask a question, they stated it. A lot of people feel that the Arab citizens of Israel will not really vote very much. Why is that? And do you think it can change in the next 6 days?
Well, it's hard to know. I predict that it will change because election time is also about trends. And the trend right now among the Arabs is to say something like, we cannot believe that things would be better. So it's better for us to be absent from the election than to try to fix the situation in vain. I think it would be a mistake because the last government really showed that Jews and Arabs can work together. And we need to take into account that Israel went into a military operation in Gaza. Israel did not change anything from anything with regards to its security situation because there was an Arab party in the coalition. And I think that the beauty of Israel is the combination of Jews and Arabs. Yeah. So I really hope that the Arab citizens will come to vote. And again, like with the Mizrahim, by the way, in the last, let's say, maybe decade or a bit less, you can see many of the young Arab Israelis are being much more integrated into the Israeli society. You can see it in the academic sphere, you can see it in the hospitals, you can see it in Tel Aviv, you can see it even in the fact that Israel is undergoing an Easternization process in terms of culture helps to bridge between Jews and Muslims in Israel. Because, for example, I don't know if you are familiar with him, but Omer Adam is maybe the most popular singer in Israel right now. Yeah, he's a Mizrahi Jew. And if you go to his shows, you can see Arabs and Jews together listening to the same music. So I think that I hope the Arabs will vote because in reality, in the Israeli society, there is a process of integration between Muslims and Jews.
Another question, someone asked if this is being recorded. Yes, the answer is yes. So you could tell your friends and anyone who missed it, because a lot of people sign up and then they decide to take a longer dinner. We do send out the link to people who registered. Question, did Begin ever meet Ben Gurion, not just in the Knesset rubbing shoulders, but actually go to him and say, I just am going to be prime minister. Do you have any words for me that are not curses?
Begin actually, shortly before the 6-Day War, when most of the people in Israel were in deep despair because they felt like that there is going to be even a second Holocaust to Israel in the waiting period for the war, Eshkol was back then the prime minister of Israel. And Eshkol was not Ben Gurion, obviously, for better or worse. And Shimon Peres, backing by many of the Israelis, was trying to replace Eshkol by Ben Gurion. I'm not sure if Ben Gurion himself was really ready to go back to be the prime minister. But one of the surprising people whom supported this idea was Begin. Begin said, in times of crisis, even though Ben Gurion harmed me and even cursed me for a long time in the political debate, I know that in times of crisis, we need Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion was really impressed by the fact that Begin was ready to help him being a prime minister again, even though they were the most, they were enemies in terms of the Israeli politics. So in the last years of Ben-Gurion, he said something like, if I knew Begin better, maybe I could establish a different relationship with him. But it doesn't mean that they became friends. They developed some sort of appreciation for each other, but it doesn't mean that they became friends during Ben-Gurion's later years.
Quick question, what did you do in China?
Oh, this was a very, very fun experience. It was 5 years ago. I did my first year as postdoc at NYU, and then I was suggested to be the first one to teach Israel studies at Beijing in Tsinghua. Tsinghua is like the Oxford University of China. And actually, most of the students, it's like if people from all over the world want to come to Harvard or Yale to be in the most prestigious Ivy League universities in America. In the third world, China is like the Ivy League of the other universities. So I had a very interesting class of people from Africa, from Russia, from China, non-Western class, totally non-Western class. And it was very interesting because, for example, just to give you a sample of the different attitude of the Chinese to Israel than the attitude of the West to Israel. If as a professor, I'm used to apologize for the occupation. In China, they used to ask me, tell me please, how do you know to take control of the Palestinians so smartly? And they understand Israel not as Israel, but as the continuation of the Jewish people from the Bible, and they talk to you about Einstein, and they even twisted anti-Semitic perception, the Jews and the money, and they ask you, please tell me how to make money. You are Jew, you know how to do it. So it's a very different place.
Next question. Basically, it's about the Begin Doctrine and nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Do you think do you think the Iran deal is going to go forward? Do you think Israel can prevent Iran from going nuclear? And well, if you can share anything from your friends, maybe in Mossad or whatever, not that I know you have friends there. What is Israel doing, if you know, and can share to try to prevent without going to a strike like with the Begin strike on Iraq?
Actually, my wife's grandfather was the deputy head of the Mossad during the 80s, but I'm not from the Mossad, so I don't know what exactly Israel is doing. But obviously, we can read from time to time about sabotaging the facilities in Iran. And I think that in a way, you know, it's a deep discussion. I think that we should reach an agreement with Iran. And if we can postpone them from having a nuclear weapon for the next 10, 15 years, like the original deal that Obama made with them, we are buying time. And as we can see today, nowadays, there might be a revolution in Iran. And I think that the combination of putting pressure by Mossad operations while working with the US to reach an agreement with Iran, even though it's not the perfect deal, life is not perfect. And if we can buy 10, 15 years of not having nuclear weapon by Iran, maybe by that time we can help, or without our help, the regime in Iran would change.
For those who may not know, and I had the pleasure of speaking to him, and he was going to speak for the organization, the Jewish Federation, where I worked, Ilan Ramon, who was a wonderful person. He actually was one of the pilots who hit the Iraqi reactor of blessed memory. Let me see, are there any other questions? With the gas deal with Lebanon possibly lead to a wider security agreement with Hezbollah?
No, I don't think that it will lead to an agreement with Hezbollah, but I think that as long as we can strengthen the Lebanese economy, it would help the Lebanese to put more pressure on Hezbollah or to diminish the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon. As long as Lebanon would grow stronger and stronger, it would be for the benefit of Israel. So even if Israel in this deal gave up on some things that Israel could insist, generally speaking, when you have now something like we have our gas platform, Lebanon has their own gas platform, it's like a good way to start building the option of reaching peace between Lebanon and Israel. But I don't think that it would lead to an agreement with Hezbollah, because as long as Hezbollah is serving the Iranian interest, Hezbollah, the fact that Hezbollah is existing is in a way, Hezbollah without being the enemy of Israel wouldn't be Hezbollah. This is what I want to say. So the deal is important with respect to the future relationship between Israel and Lebanon, but not with respect to Israel and Hezbollah.
So two questions, you can do it as short as you want. One, is it really Begin who wanted to really push for the rescue of the Beit Israel of Ethiopian Jews?
Yes, it's a great question. And again, just like with the Mizrahim, because for Begin, each and every Jew is equal, there is no cultural hierarchy, it was easier to start bringing the Ethiopian Jews to Israel during Begin's era, and not during other eras in which the Ethiopian Jews were perceived as lower in their status, in their cultural status.
And the other one is, we're going to be showing sometime in year round for the film festival, the movie, The Dove Flyer. Have you ever heard of it? It's about the emigration of Iraqi Jews from Iraq around the time of the state of Israel being born.
No, but you must invite me. Maybe it's about my family.
Right. So, okay. So I will be in touch with you. It's a wonderful film. It's a few years old, and so I'll be in touch because anyhow, I want to thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I know you're going to write a book about a subject I'm interested in, which is the Neely spy ring. So if you have it translated in English, we'll definitely have you do a book talk on it. Toda rabah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, toda rabah, Avi, toda rabah.
Toda Riva,
Excellent.
toda lekulam. I'm
And
going to sleep.
we'll try to get a sabbatical at UC Berkeley, and we'll take some adult education classes with you. You really are a very good teacher. Again, everyone, the film Disobedience, about the Portuguese Consul General, a true story, who gave out life-saving visas to Jews and then was kicked out of the foreign ministry of Portugal because they didn't like what he did, and he actually died penniless. And only decades later was his reputation salvaged by my former boss, Robert Jacobitz, at the Federation. And there's a movie made about what he did. Anyhow, everyone, good night, be safe. And toda rabah again, excellent presentation.
Toda Riva.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Toda rabah.
Toda, Shabbat Shalom. Bye.
You too.